Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Over the years, I have come down here regularly to the chamber, one of the most iconic symbols of our wonderful democracy, and urged the United States to do more to support the cause of freedom for my native homeland, the island nation of Cuba. And in tow would be posters, just like the one I have here today, depicting images of the real Cuba, the Cuba in which opposition to the Castro regime is met with violence and harassment, extrajudicial punishment and confinement in one of the many Cuban gulags built by Fidel Castro. These images would show what the regime under Fidel Castro would do to the ladies in white depicted here. These women, clad in white, carrying flowers, march peacefully to Catholic Church every Sunday, praying for their loved ones wrongfully imprisoned by the regime, only to be harassed and beaten by Castro's thugs. I came to this floor to offer my support for these brave women, like Laura Poyang, who was mysteriously killed, no doubt by the regime, and Berta Soler, pictured here. Mr. Speaker, I have come to this very floor denouncing the Castro regime's treatment of opposition leaders like Jorge Luis Garcia Antunes Perez, who was in prison for 17 years by Castro for speaking out against communism and refusing the regime's communist re-education program. I spoke out in support of Dr. Oscar Elias Bisset, who was sentenced to 25 years in Castro's prisons for crimes committed against Cuban sovereignty, which in Cuba is code for calling for reforms. And he was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom by George W. Bush. And I stood here for Coco Fariñas, right over here. Coco Fariñas went on a 50-day hunger strike just recently to bring attention to the plight of the Cuban people. And I also spoke in favor of Cuban rapper El Sexto, pictured here, who was jailed just last week, again, when the regime announced the tyrant's death. I stood here in solidarity with Cubans, freedom fighters like Antonio Rodiles, pictured here, who was arrested hours before President Obama landed in Cuba earlier this year. Round up the usual suspects. I have come to this well time and time again to call attention to the abuses being committed by Fidel Castro against the Cuban people, the people of the homeland that I was forced to flee along with my family when I was a little girl, and to the people who've had everything taken away from them and could not speak for themselves. And I have come repeatedly to this very podium to call my colleagues' attention to the threat that Fidel Castro and his regime pose to the U.S. and our national security. This thug, Fidel Castro, who attempted to infiltrate every level of our government through its intelligence service, like convicted spy Ana Belén Montes, who is currently still serving her prison sentence in a Texan jail. And this despot who aligned himself with the greatest threats to the U.S., like Iran and Russia, and allowed Russia to put up a facility in Cuba in order to spy on our nation. This autocrat told the Ayatollah in Iran that both Iran and Cuba would bring the U.S. to its knees, and who tried to bring the world to nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And yet, this is a man who some world leaders and media want to romanticize. They whitewash his horrific crimes and claim that he was a legendary folk hero. The truth is, Mr. Speaker, Fidel Castro was a sadistic murderer, a tyrant, and a hypocrite. He was a thug who took control over all industries in Cuba and decried capitalism, yet somehow he was likely worth about $1 billion when he died. When 11 million Cubans are barely struggling to get by under his communist regime, this is a tyrant who died with more wealth than the entire island nation. Mr. Speaker, Fidel Castro is dead, and Cuba and the world are better for it. Now we have an opportunity to move forward by reversing some of this administration's concessions to the Castro regime and press for reforms. It's time for the Cuban people to have the opportunity to achieve freedom and democracy for which they have been yearning. We must pressure the regime in the island of Cuba. We must not relent until there are free and fair elections, until all political prisoners are freed, and until the people's basic and fundamental human rights are restored. Is that too much to ask for the enslaved and oppressed people of Cuba? Let that be how we honor the countless Cubans who have lost their lives or who have suffered under the terrible dictatorship of Fidel Castro. That is some legacy. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.